So thank you for joining us here today in Washington Heights as we continue a series we began several weeks ago. It's entitled Fearless. It's based in an Old Testament book called Joshua. And here's the thing that we have been just unpacking in all of the weeks prior to today. This story reads and plays out a lot like an action movie. And, you know, my wife and I, on Friday, we went to see Mission Impossible, the new one, on the first day, and it is awesome. And I'm a sucker for all of those movies. And it's just suspense and action all the way through. And as I was sitting there and watching that, I'm thinking, well, there is, this similarity to Joshua because, man, there are battles and there's espionage and there's people working together and then some who are working against them and all of that. And as we come to this part of the story, about midway through the book, the action kind of comes to a halt because a lot of the fighting is over. And trying to occupy this land, most of it has now been taken. And so what they're trying to decide now is who is going to live where. And so you've got all these different groups, and they're talking about, living here and whose boundary and border is going to be over there. So what was action, packed movie has now become like a board meeting in which people are a lot of times are bored in a board meeting and they're trying to figure out who's going to be where and all of that. But something happens in the middle of that board meeting because somebody walks into that meeting and they are not a new character in this story. And what they have to say in that moment is the stuff of legend, but only this is true. And to begin to turn our mind in that direction of the person that we're going to meet, somebody who from God's perspective, his opinion of that person, he says, that person followed me wholeheartedly. Wow. What does it look like for God to say, there's somebody who follows me wholeheartedly? There are different times, whether it's in the history of the world, the history of our nation, when people just exude confidence and courage, and it is especially the most meaningful when the need for it is the greatest. And I was reading about one of those encounters in the history of our own nation here in America. And it was during the Revolutionary War, and General George Washington is leading the troops, and they have just suffered a great defeat in New York City, and they just managed to escape, and they've retreated, and they've gone across the Delaware River and all of that, and they're trying to regroup, and there's another battle that's going to be coming. But here's a challenge that General George Washington faced, is that all of his troops signed up for a year at a time. He had 3,000 left. And as he addresses them and the conditions are bad, it's the middle of winter. In fact, the date is December 31st. The next day, all of them could go home. And a general without an army doesn't have anybody left to fight with. And for all intents and purposes, that battle would be over. So General Washington gathers his troops together, and hear are the words that he spoke to them on that day, because he could not make them stay. He said these words, "My brave fellows, you have done all that I asked you to do, and more than could be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake, your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with fatigue and hardships, but we know not how to spare you." In other words, there's more to come of what is hard. "And if you will consent to stay 1 month longer, you will render that service to the country of liberty and to your country, which you can probably never do under any other circumstances." And he had a guy with him who started to play a drum and just kind of do that drum roll. And he waited for somebody and really his whole troops to step forward. And you know what happened? Nobody stepped forward. And he waited some more, and the drum continued to play. And then you know what happened? One guy, and to this day, his name is unknown to us. One guy steps forward. And not long after that, all of the rest of those 3,000 troops step forward and they say, we'll continue to serve. And the rest, as they say, is history. And that's why we don't speak the Queen's English, do we? Not even close. We speak American instead, right? And we don't like fish and chips and all those other things that come along with it. And all that was hanging in the balance there, one guy, we don't even know his name, influenced so much. And I don't know about you, but I hear stories like that and I read stories like that and I think, man, I want to be that guy. Who wouldn't want to be that person of courage? Who has the wisdom to know what to do and the courage to do it? Well, we're going to meet somebody just like that today in this story called Fearless. And here's the thing, we're going to talk about fear and faith. And if I were sitting where you are right now and someone were talking where I am right now, I would probably have this idea in my mind that I just want to kind of give a parenthesis to what we're going to say, through the rest of today. I recognize that there can be some faith that gets a little bit weird and maybe even a little bit toxic. And so not all faith, is the kind that is good for us and healthy for us. And I also recognize that there are things in this world that to fear them is actually a good thing because there are sometimes fear is there to help us, not to work against us. And I don't know if you heard this story. It happened just last year in February of 2017. But a little boy who was in the process of being potty trained is going to go use the potty in Abilene, Texas. And he lifts the lid on the potty. And you know what he finds in the potty? They took a picture of it. A Western diamondback rattlesnake. Don't you think that could mess up the whole potty training thing right off the bat? I am never using the toilet again. Are you kidding me? Well, he gets his mom, and she gets an older sibling, and they get some garden tools, and they dispense of this snake. And then Dad comes home later that day because he's been working, and he gets an idea, and he says, I better get a snake removal company here just to check things out. And that was a smart move. You know why? Because under the house, they discovered 24 Western diamondback rattlesnakes that were living under the house. Sometimes fear is good, right? And not all faith is good. Sometimes it's toxic. But what we're going to talk about today is the kind of faith that allows us to experience more of what God has for us and helps us to remove the kind of fear that paralyzes us and keeps us from taking steps in the direction that God has for us. And we're going to meet somebody, and we do know his name. His name is Caleb. And this is what God says about Caleb in the book of Numbers. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit, and sometimes, different can mean a whole lot of different things. This is a positive difference and follows me, and here it is, wholeheartedly. I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. And when I see that kind of assessment by God, I don't know about you, but I think I want to be that guy. So what did he do? And what does his faith look like? And from the very beginning of this adventure called the book of Joshua, God made it really clear that there are a couple dynamics that are playing out, and he said it, and we saw it in our video here, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged. And that can be a real, experience in this broken world of ours. That we operate out of fear. We operate out of discouragement. We play it safe. And why shouldn't we think that way? Because we're all that? No, because for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And so part of this whole journey has been real people in the middle of real life learning, just as we can, that God can be trusted. We can operate out of faith, not crazy, toxic, weird faith, but a faith that helps us to experience more of what God has for us and less fear that paralyzes us and keeps us away from what God has for us. We see that dynamic playing out time and again, and we're going to see it again today. Fear versus faith, and how is it that we can operate out of faith? So the board meeting is going on, and now I want to parachute us into the middle of that board meeting, and we're going to read through this whole section, and we're going to talk about the faith of Caleb. This is from Joshua chapter 14. A delegation from the tribe of Judah, led by Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, came to Joshua at Gilgal. Caleb said to Joshua, "Remember what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, about you and me when we were at Kadesh Barnea." And let me just hit the pause button, because what is he talking about? 45 years before this encounter, this nation that God was leading had set them free from slavery in Egypt. He had led them immediately to the borders of the promised land, and he told them that this is what he had for them. And Moses sends in 12 scouts or spies, if you will, to check out the land. What does it look like? You come back and you bring a report. 10 of those who were sent in came back and said, "We can't do this. It's crazy. There are giants in the land. They're too strong. They're too well defended. We can never accomplish this." Well, 2 of them came back and said, "We can do it. And God is with us, and he's giving us this land. Let's go for it." Do you know who the 2 were that said, "Yes, we can"? Joshua, who's been the central player in the story from the very beginning, and Caleb. And so Caleb now, 45 years later, comes face to face with the guy with whom he had gone on that mission, who was in agreement with him that, hey, God is with us, but that's not how it turned out. Because what swept the camp when all those reports came back is what the 10 said, and they got afraid, and they turned away. And for the last 40 years, they've been wandering in the wilderness. And now that whole generation of adults is gone, except for these 2 guys. And here they are now, face to face. And Caleb reminds him, "Do you remember what God said, what God promised all those years ago?" Well, what is that? "I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land of Canaan. I returned and gave an honest report. But my brothers who went with me frightened the people from entering the promised land. For my part, I wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God. So that day Moses solemnly promised me, the land of Canaan on which you were just walking will be your grant of land and that of your descendants forever, because you wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God." Now, as you can see, the Lord has kept me alive, and as well as he has promised me all these 45 years since Moses made this promise, even while Israel wandered in the wilderness, today I am 85 years old. I am as strong now as I was when Moses sent me on that journey. I think his perspective might be a little bit off. And I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. So give me the hill country that the Lord promised me. You will remember that as scouts we found the descendants of Anak living there in great and walled towns. But if the Lord is with me, I will drive them out of the land, just as the Lord said. Don't you love this guy? And when I read that and I see what this guy is like, I think, I want to be that guy. What is it about him? What is it about his faith that led God to assess it this way? He's got a different spirit in a good way. And he followed me wholeheartedly. He was all in with all that he had. Well, what does that look like? What does that mean? So in the time that we have, what I want to do is I want to unpack Caleb's wholehearted faith, reflecting on some of those words that he spoke in the middle of that board meeting that help us to understand what is inside the kind of heart of a person who is fully committed, who follows God wholeheartedly. A couple things. Here's the first one. God's promise delayed is not God's promise denied. And here's what he says right when he meets Joshua. He says, you remember what the Lord said to us on that day all those years ago? Remember what the Lord said to Moses? And I wonder if Joshua was thinking, that was 45 years ago. But to Caleb, it is as real and as relevant and as important and as current and as much a promise of God on this day as it was 45 years earlier. And so just because there's the passage of time, Caleb doesn't say, well, you know what, all of God's promises have a statute of limitation to them, and we've kind of passed that mark, and so now that we're all these years later, I guess that was, maybe fulfilled in some spiritual way that I don't fully understand. No, Caleb shows up on this day, and he says, you know what, those words are as true as they had ever been, and yeah, it didn't turn out exactly the way that we thought before, but maybe this is the time. In fact, God's promise is about to come true. I think there's a dynamic that can enter into the arena of faith for people like us. And maybe I want to talk more about myself than talk about you, but maybe you've experienced the same kind of thing. That when faith is new and fresh and young, it can seem vibrant and maybe even a little bit raw. That we just trust God for things that, are just a little bit crazy. But we don't know any better. Because all of a sudden, there is this God who is bigger than we can even imagine. But then as time goes on, that faith that maybe if we refer to it as being a little bit barbaric when we start, it gets a little more civilized. And what trusted God in radical ways now gets tempered down. And we just kind of get to the place where we think, well, you know what? Let's not expect too much because nothing's happened, for a long period of time. Maybe that was fulfilled in another way. Maybe it's just something entirely different. See, there's a danger when it comes to the arena of faith, and it's called presuming on God. Presuming on God is when we sometimes think, if I just believe it enough, God is obligated somehow to do it for me. That's dangerous stuff. Because God is not obligated to us, and instead of us trying to get God on our page, we would be much wiser to get on God's page and experience what He has for us. And so there are moments in which we can presume on God. But let me tell you the other side of that whole dynamic that I think happens a whole lot more often and is a whole lot more dangerous. And that's where we don't expect much of anything from God. And time goes on and we think, yeah, you know what, this heart of mine, or people around me, or the circumstances in which I work or I live or whatever it is, you know what, it's been a while and I haven't seen anything change. And that is where our vision of God is much too small. And don't take it from me, but take it from an 85-year-old guy who's holding on to a promise made 45 years earlier, who says, this is the time and this is the day. And just because there's been a lot of water under the bridge doesn't mean that God has just let go of that. If God promised it, God is true to His word. And this is not a faith, that says, hey, and you know what? So you just go name and claim anything you want because, God is then just going to fulfill that. What started that whole deal was God's promise. And really what this invites us to do is to draw closer to God, be more and more familiar with His promises. But here's the thing that you can know. If God promised it, He will deliver. But one of the real life decisions of faith that we have to make is, will we trust Him with the timing, not just with the answer? This promise about a promised land, which is why we often refer to it that way, of the promised land, because God promised it not first to Joshua, He promised it to a guy named Abraham, and we think, well, who is that, and where is he in the whole scheme of the story? From the time of Abraham's death to the birth of Joshua, there's 400 years. And so there was a guy who first heard that promise, and he didn't even see the fulfillment of it with his own eyes in this world of ours. Did that invalidate the promise of God? No. And there are some things we may need to wait. There are some things we may not even see with these eyes of ours. But if God has promised it, God keeps his promises because it is based in the character and the nature of God. And so on this day, Caleb comes and says, hey, look, this isn't just my thinking. You remember what the Lord said to Moses? It's God's promise. And so it is every bit real and relevant and current. Is there a place maybe where you've let it slip a little bit? You think, well, there's been some time that's gone by. I guess it wasn't for me. I've kind of written that whole thing off. And maybe my whole idea and picture of God is I set it a little bit too high, and I need to shrink my view of God down. It could well be that we've got too small a picture of God. And Caleb tells us, if God promised it, delay is not denial. You hold on to the promises of God because they're based not in ourselves, they're based in the character and the nature of God. Another part of Caleb's wholehearted faith, if I'm here, God has a purpose for me. Here's what he says in the middle of that exchange. Now, as you can see, the Lord has kept me alive. Yeah, there was something that played out 45 years ago, and I'm still here. I'm breathing air. And so he thinks there's something that God has behind that. If I'm here, there's a purpose. There's a reason for me to be here. And I think this part of the story is so crucial because you know what would have been so easy for Caleb to do is to play the victim. And let me tell you why. Do you know where he was born? He was born in slavery in Egypt. Because he was part of that whole effort before it even began, and now he is here all these years later. And those are circumstances beyond his control, right? The situation into which we're born, the circumstances around that, we think, man, I had no say over that. I have, no influence over that. It just is what it is. And if we look at that experience for ourselves and we think, it just isn't fair. I had the deck stacked against me from day one. Well, then Caleb's your guy because he didn't do that. He also had this opportunity because, remember, he was one of the two that came back from that land and says, let's do it. But that's not how it turned out. How easy would it have been for Caleb to point the finger at all the other people that were around him saying, I was ready to go, but they weren't. It's their fault. And the reason we're here is because of them and why I'm experiencing this negative stuff playing out in my life. I had to wander around the wilderness for 40 years too. I wanted to go in. And how easy to point the finger at others, to play the victim, and to say, it's not my fault, it's their fault. It's circumstances beyond my control, it's the people around me, it's their doing, it's this and that and the other thing. And I got to tell you, if we play the victim, we will never experience victory. Never. Because we are guaranteeing what the outcome of that is going to be. And we will find reasons and we will find excuses and we will put the blame on other people until the cows come home. But here is a guy who says, you know what? I don't know how all that played out. I don't know exactly why it played out the way that it did. But here's what I know today. God has kept me alive. And so there is a reason for me to be here right here and now. And I think the easy part of this application is for us to look and say, well, if you're older, and you're retired, know that there's a reason for you. And now that I'm on the dark side of 50, this takes on a whole new meaning for me as well to say, oh man, the decades are getting less and shorter and all of that. There is still a reason to be here. But let me also tell you this. More and more, I meet people who are not 85 and not on the dark side of 50. But who are 15 and 25 and 30. And they're not sure that there's a reason for them to be here. And if you've ever felt that way, can I just say it as bluntly as I can? You are wrong. There is a reason that you are here. And it is a reason that is bigger than you because there is a God that is behind you and a God who is for you. And God doesn't make any junk and God doesn't do things for no reason. And the fact that you are here and you are breathing air means that God has something for you. Now, when we look at this story, we go, well, I'm not sure there's a whole lot more land to conquer. Your purpose may not look exactly like that. But make no mistake about it, your purpose, your reason for being here is every bit as important. And you might say, well, how in the world am I supposed to know how I can find God's purpose, God's direction for me? How would I ever know that? Here's some words that are spoken in the New Testament by a guy by the name of Paul. Ephesians chapter 2. For we are God's, would you read the next word with me? Masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the good things He planned for us long ago. Does God make junk? No, He's making masterpieces. And we may still be a masterpiece under construction. That's who we are, but that's where it's going. And He has good things, and they are not just random things. They are things behind which He has purpose and intentions, and it's been that way for a long, long time. And if you say, well, that is great, where would I even begin? How do I start to understand what that might be? And I got to tell you, there's no formula to figure that out. It's not you just, enter this and it's going to spit out, the exact answer to that. I think what we learned from the whole story of Joshua is that, as important as a destination to which we get is the process that gets us there, because in real life moments, what we can do is learn to trust God more and more. So it's not just that God writes us an easy answer there. Some of it is a struggle along the way where we learn, what? God can be trusted. And there is a way to operate out of faith. And so it's not just about the destination, it's about the process. But I also think that there are some ways we can begin to get a compass heading about what God has for us. Let me give you one suggestion, and I did not come up with this. I think this was started by a guy out of a church called Saddleback Church, Rick Warren. And the encouragement is to understand your shape. Well, what does that stand for? S stands for spiritual gifts. When you step into a relationship with God by His grace, you put your trust in Him. God gives you a whole bunch of gifts. One is a gift of eternal life, and that is awesome. You know what else He gives you? Spiritual gifts. What are those? They are God-given abilities to do something that you could never do on your own, to make a difference for God's sake. And there's a whole host of what those are. And they're across the whole spectrum, and they are not about us ultimately. They are about being able to serve God, which often is by serving others. The letter H stands for heart. And maybe the best way to understand what heart means is to put it in this form of a question. What are you passionate about? What do you care about? What is it in this world that maybe gives you this sense of holy discontent when you look at something in this world and you say, it shouldn't be that way and somebody should do something about it? That's a heart issue. And could it be that God has put that on your heart so that you can be a part of making it different than what it is? What matters to you? What do you care about? The letter A stands for abilities. They're just some natural abilities that we've all been given. And we don't all have the same abilities. In fact, there is a phrase in this country that's been around for a while, and I think this phrase is false. And it goes something like this. Kids are in school, and they are told this message. If you study really hard, you can be anything you want to be. Can I just tell you, I don't think that's true. I don't think everybody has a natural ability with numbers. Can I get an amen? And you're just not going to excel in that field. And there's all kinds of different ways in which we can look and say, yeah, I can't do that, but you can do something. And so I think we're called to lean in the direction of our abilities. And so what are those? The letter P stands for personality. How are you wired? What kind of person are you? And there's all kinds of different personalities, right? The most obvious thing is there are extroverts and introverts. Extroverts are people who show up in the middle of a crowd, and man, they get energized by that, and they've met everybody before 5 minutes go by. And let me just say, us introverts forgive you for being like that. I'm just kidding. But we're different, right? And not everybody is the same. And so personality can sometimes dictate the way in which we're going to be involved. Do we like to be in front of people? Do we like to be behind the scenes? There are all kinds of different shades of what meaning that brings. That's not right or wrong. Letter E is experiences. What have you experienced? What have you gone through? And here's another principle from life together with God in the arena of faith, is that none of our experiences, not even the hard ones, not even our hurts, are wasted. And sometimes what we go through allows us to help people going through a very similar thing. And some of the best helpers that I've ever seen are not church staff members. They are healed helpers who are able to reach back and to help others with the same deal. So what's your shape? And if you're thinking, well, yeah, it'd be really cool to figure that out. Here's what I found online. You can take a free shape test at freeshapetest.com. And you can do that today. You can do that later this week. And it just asks you a series of questions. And it'll give you, I believe, a compass heading. Remember, this is not a formula. This is a way maybe for us to have a better handle on who God has made us to be, which can clue us in all the more to the way in which we can be engaged with what God has for us. Because if you're here and you're breathing air, God has a purpose for you. One more part of Caleb's faith. God's promise delayed is not promise. God's promise denied. If I'm here, God has a purpose for me. And then finally, God is able, no matter the obstacle. And we see that in what Caleb says. He says a bunch of phrases here near the end of what he brings to Joshua. So give me the hill country. Now, you don't have to be an expert in warfare to know this. What is the hardest terrain to attack? It's elevated terrain, occupied by the enemy. What's the easiest terrain to defend from somebody? The elevated land. So Caleb looks at the scenario. Most of the land has been conquered, but not the hill country. Why not? Because it's the hardest terrain to take. Caleb says, let me at them. Give me the hardest terrain. And then in addition to that, he says, you know, who lives there? The descendants of Anak live there. And we don't know a whole lot about them, but here's the deal. These are like giants. Just imagine, you know, NBA players are occupying the elevated ground, and they're huge, and they're strong, and they're really good at fighting. And Caleb says, yeah, that's where I'm going. And one more piece that he says along with it. And they live in these great walled towns. They have superior defenses. And an 85-year-old dude riding on a promise of God comes face to face with somebody that he's known for a long time, and he says, let me at him. And we might think, man, there is a self-confident person who's got it all together, and man, do I wish I could nurture up inside of myself that kind of courage. But there's one more piece to this whole story, and it is the place where Caleb's ultimate confidence lies. And here's what he says: if the Lord is with me, I'll drive them out. And the clear implication of what he says is that if God is not with him, he ain't got nothing. But if God is with him, there can be success. So let me ask you this when it comes to faith. When was the last time I ever said something like this? If God is with me, I will what? If God is with me, I will finally and fully overcome that addiction that plagues me again and again and again, and I've tried and I haven't been able to do it. But if God is with me, I will. If God is with me, that relationship that has been dead and buried with no signs of life for so long, it can be resurrected. There can be reconciliation. If God is with me. There's no hope, humanly speaking. But if God is with me, it changes everything. If God is with me, I'll be able to forgive somebody who hurt me in real ways that are as fresh and as hurtful all these days and maybe years later, just as it was on the day when it happened. I can't do it myself. because it doesn't seem fair and it doesn't seem right. And it seems like it's just letting them off the hook. But if God is with me, that changes everything. When was the last time in the arena of our faith that we needed God to show up, for something to happen? Because if we don't have those moments and times, and it doesn't mean that it has to happen every moment of every day, but if we don't have a faith that at some point requires God to show up, for there to be honest to goodness, change and victory and hope, our vision of God is too small. And we need to enlarge our image of who God really is. So let me ask you this question as we wind down. What would you do if you knew that God was with you? My guess is we wouldn't play it as safe as we often do. My guess is we would probably operate more out of faith than we do out of fear, naturally in and of ourselves. My guess is that we would seek God more, trust God more, follow Him more. When was the last time you needed God to show up? And the good news is, and we were singing about this not that long ago, He's the God who is for us. He's fighting for us. Will we join Him in what He has for us? I'm going to invite you to bow your heads together with me. And just before I pray, a relationship to begin with is there because it's God's doing. And on our own, we could never rescue ourselves. And so God has come to our rescue. And what He invites us to do is to put our hope and our trust in Him. Jesus came and took on our worst enemy, sin and death. And He came out alive and well on the other side. The good news is, when we're together with Him, the victory's already been won. It's His doing. And so if you've never taken that step of faith and trust, maybe you thought, in some way you had to get your act together, you had to get yourself right, you had to make yourself good enough for God. Let me just encourage you, abandon all hope in yourself and put all of your trust in the awesome God who has come to your rescue. And just acknowledge to Him that you need Him, that you're committing yourself to Him and to follow along after Him. And in that moment, God meets us there, and there's no special words, no magic words, no formula there either. And it's a step we can take here and now. It's something we can do anywhere, anytime, because God, He hears a sincere heart. And He meets you there in that place. God, thank You for who You are and the many ways in which You pour out Your goodness and Your grace on us. Thank You for all the opportunities that we have to follow You in this life that You've given to us. And God, I pray that as the days and weeks and months and years go on for us, that we would learn that You are a God who can be trusted, and that You are as good as Your word, and that our hope is found in You. God, draw us close to You. Help us all to experience more of what You have for us. And we ask You to lead us all in that direction, not for our sake, but for Your sake. And so we ask and pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.